In this video tutorial, I'm going to show you how to summarize data in Excel using the pivot tables. Following that, I'll go ahead and show you how to make scatter plots with your numerical data. So here you have your data, and specifically you're interested in graphing out your temperature versus the behaviors. And we have two categories here, juveniles and adults. So the first thing to do is to highlight the data that you want to graph. And then you go up here to the Insert ribbon, select Pivot Table. And the pivot table verifies that you wanted this range of data, so just double check the columns and the row numbers. And then it asks you where you want to put the pivot table. I like to put it in the same worksheet so that I can look at the data at the same time. So I'll just put it right next to the worksheet and the data. So the pivot table then gives you all of the column headings of the data that you had highlighted. And you're going to put those different column headings in the different sections. So first, I want to make sure that I have for my rows temperatures. And you can see here on the pivot table that now I have rows of temperatures. And then I want to add to those temperatures those different behaviors. So I'm going to select behaviors and put them down here in the sum value columns for behavior 1 and for behavior 2. But it's summations, and I don't really want summations. I actually want to have averages. So I'm going to go back over here, click on that eye on the right, brings up that pivot filled window, and I'll select average, and then I'll click OK. And you can see that for behavior 1 now the count has been averaged across days for that particular temperature. And then I want to take behavior 2, do the same thing, and I'll select average again so that I get an average of behavior 2. Great. But the data here are for both the juveniles and adults. So I do want to break out separately the data for juveniles and adults. And to do that, I have to select my category field, and I'm going to drag that into the filters pane. And you can see now there's this added row here for category, and if I click on this down arrow, it brings up a new window showing that it's showing data for the adult and the juveniles. In order to be selective, I can select either adult or juvenile, so I would just click on select all to deselect everything, and then click on adult. And so now it shows just the data for my adults for each of those behaviors at each of those temperatures. And next, what I can do is I can also then show the behaviors for the juveniles by deselecting adults, selecting juveniles, and you see here that the juvenile data are now shown in this pane here. In order to graph the data, I have to highlight the information that I want to put on my graph, and in this graph we're going to create a scatter plot. So I'll highlight these data here, and then if I try to insert a graph at this point, it's going to be very unhappy. So if I select scattered plot, it says I can't create a chart because right now I'm selecting data in the pivot table. So I do need to copy the data from the pivot table and move it outside of the pivot table in order to graph it. So I can just go over to copy, and then I'll select a separate location on my worksheet. And then I can right click and paste. And now when I do that, I have all of my data outside of the pivot table, which will allow me to graph it. I'm going to just label this juvenile to remind me that these are the data for the juveniles. So I'm going to do the same thing for the adults. I'm going to go back up here and select the adult. And that way I have my adult data, and now I can go ahead and copy the information and paste it outside. So here I'll copy, select copy, and then I'll paste. You can either right click or you can use the menus. And again, I'll just label this as adult so I don't lose track of which data are which. Oops. Okay, there we go. There are two different scatter plots that I'm going to show you how to graph. The top one puts the juveniles and adults and all the behaviors on one graph, which I think is a little cluttered. The bottom shows a single behavior and differences between juveniles and adults. So I'll show you both of those. Okay, so for the first one, you want to highlight one behavior and then your temperatures. And for one category, in this case juvenile, go to the Insert ribbon and you're going to select Scatterplot. And we'll do the Scatterplot here. It's a simple Scatterplot. Select that, and then Excel comes up automatically with the Scatterplot. Just move it out of the way here so that we could see it. And you can see here on the bottom, the x-axis are temperature data, and then the y-axis are the averages of those behavior counts. And each dot, of course, represents those counts. Now, if I want to add the second behavior onto this same graph, what I need to do is I will select the graph, the chart, right-click, and I'm going to select data. And it's going to bring up this window that shows me right now what's being graphed. So right now, just going to move this over, and you can see the name of the variable that's being graphed is on J38, and that's making a reference to the Excel spreadsheet. So if I look over onto the spreadsheet at J38, I see average of behavior 1 count, which is what the label is for this particular graph. The X values are in column I, and so those are, of course, the temperatures, so that looks right. And then the Y values are in column J, and this is column J, so yeah, so those are my average of behaviors for that particular variable. Okay, so I do want to add the additional behavior 2, and so I'm just going to click on this plus sign. It brings up a new window of series 2, which is unnamed yet. So I can click on this field, and I'm going to select the cell with the behavior 2 count. For the X values, I'm going to use the same temperature values, so I'll highlight those. And then for the Y values, those are going to be, of course, the behavior counts. So I'll just highlight this and replace it with the actual values for the behavior 2 counts, the average of the behavior 2 counts. Okay, so now over in the legend entries on the left, I have both behavior 1 and behavior 2. So, okay. And you can see that a new set of symbols have been added, these orange symbols, which represent behavior 2. I do want to show what these symbols represent, and in order to do that, I want to add a legend. So if I go over to Chart Design, the ribbon up here, add a chart element, I can select down about 2/3 of the way, legend. And I'll just put it at the top. So I can see then what each of the symbols represent, but the labels themselves aren't very helpful, right? It's average. So let's just change the labels so that they're a little more informative and succinct. So I'll just call this juvenile behavior 1. And then I'll call this second one juvenile behavior 2. And the juvenile is helpful because I'm going to be adding the adult data to this. Okay, so now you can see the legend representing, indicating what those symbols mean. So now we're going to go ahead and add the adult data to the same graph. So I'll select the graph and then right click, select data, These are the same steps we did before when we added the second behavior. And you can see that the legend also reflects the new labels that I added. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new series, which again is blank. I'm going to select the first behavior for the adult as my name for that particular symbol or series. I'll select the same X values, which are the temperatures. And then I'll also select the values of behavior 1, and those would be in this column here. So I've got everything there, and I'm going to go ahead and just add the second adult behavior since I'm already in this window. So I'll select the name of the second adult behavior, the same temperatures for my X values, and then the average of the behaviors for my Y values. There we go. So now you can see in the legend entries on the left, all 4 of my entries, which means I should have 4 sets of dots. Okay. And so on this graph, we've added additional symbols, which are indicated in the legend. But again, I'm going to just change the name of those symbols so that there's something a little more informative. Adult behavior 1, adult behavior 2. There we go. Okay. So now I have a collection of dots. It would be super helpful if I can add a trend line in order to see if there's any trends related to the temperature itself. So I'm just going to go up here to the chart design ribbon, select add chart element, click on that, and then go down to trend line. And there's a few ways that you can add a trend line. So this is one. And you have several different options for trend lines. You could select linear, but I'm just going to show you a different way that you can add a trend line. So select more trend line options, and here it shows you all 4 of those series. So if you wanted to just add a trend line to 1, for example. So I'm going to select juvenile behavior 1 and click OK. And you can see it brings up this format trend line pane on the right, and it's already added a linear trend line for my juvenile behavior 1. I'm going to select the second behavior and go back up here, go to trend line, and this is much faster if you just click on linear after having selected the symbols, and it adds a second trend line for juvenile behavior 2. And I'll do this next for adult behavior 1, add trend line, linear, there we go. And then I'll do this for adult behavior 2, add trend line, and then select linear. Okay, okay, something's very odd happening with this adult behavior 2. There's no trend line. Maybe there was some mistake in how it was set up, so I'm just going to right click on this. It is highlighting the correct data. I'm just going to have a look at the data itself. So here it's showing adult behavior 2. It's showing how it was all set up. I'm just double checking. So yeah, I've got data from K45 to 47. Yeah, that's right. Okay, well, I don't really know why it didn't add a trend line here, but I'm just, for graphing purposes, I'm just going to go ahead and move on. Okay, so the second graph that we're going to do is the one on the bottom where it shows a single behavior for both juveniles and adults. So I'm going to go ahead and just move this up a little bit so I have room to put the graph there. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead, do the same kinds of steps I did before. I'm going to first select my X and Y data for the juvenile. Go up here to insert a scatter plot. And here I have my juvenile behavior 1 on the single scatter plot. So remember, I also want to add the adult behavior one as a comparison. So as we did before, I'm going to right click on the chart and select data. And I'm going to add, let's move this over. It's going to you can see here that these are all of the same data for my juvenile behavior one. Okay, just wanted to check that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and add my adult behavior one with the same temperature data. So I click on the plus sign here to add a series to this legend. I need to name my variable, so I'll click on this adult behavior one. Select the data for my X values. So I'll click on those temperatures. And then the corresponding Y values for adult behavior one. Okay, that looks pretty good. We'll click OK. All right, so here I've got my juvenile behavior and I have my adult behavior one. You can see they're very different. Also indicate what each of the symbols represent. So I'll do that by adding a legend, because the blue is supposed to be the juvenile behavior one and the orange are juvenile behavior two. So I select the chart, I go up to add chart element, and I'll do a trend line later. Okay, so select legend, and then I'm just going to put the legend up at the top. So there it shows juvenile behavior one and juvenile behavior two. I also am going to add a trend line. So there we go. So I've added a trend line for juvenile behavior one, and then I'm just going to select the orange, go up to add chart element, and add a trend line for the adult behavior one. There we go. Great. I also want to add some axes to the scatter plot. So right now I've got my juvenile behavior one, my adult behavior one as it relates to temperature, but I don't have a label. So I want to add a label to my x-axis, which is the temperature, and a label to my y-axis, which is going to be the behaviors. So if I go over to first I have to select the chart, and I go over to the chart design, add chart element, and then scroll down to axis title. I'll do my primary horizontal title first, and you'll see a text box will be added. And I'll just double click on the title there and replace it with temperature. And it is important to put what units you're using. So these are in Celsius, which is what your data should be in. So I'll just put C in parentheses. And now I have my label for my x-axis. Okay, so I also want to label my y-axis. So I go up to add chart element again, select axis title, and primary vertical. So here I'm going to rename my y-axis. Let's see how much time was it for these data. Okay, so we had 600 minutes, so these data were collected over a period of 10-minute intervals. So I'm going to go ahead then and double click on the axis title here and replace that with a more informative title, which will be behavior rate. In parentheses, I'll put the units, which is per 10 minutes. Okay, so I do want to do some other formatting. In particular, overall, if the data if the chart is going to be presented in a presentation, you do want to add a chart title to it. And we'll do that above the chart. So you just go up to Add Elements, Chart Title, above the chart, and it adds a text box, and I can add a chart title here. If this is for your research paper, then you don't add a chart title. Instead, you'll have a caption down below. Okay, and then I also want to just make this a little bigger. So if I was going to use this in a presentation, the font sizes themselves are pretty small. And so what I want to do is just increase the overall font sizes so that they're more easily read by an audience. So I'm going to just click on the chart, click on Home, and change the font size to 14 point. There we go. Okay, so then at this point, I've got nice readable axes, font large enough, but the scale itself is pretty wide considering that we're dealing with temperatures. And I don't really need it to go all the way down to 0. So the last thing I'm going to do is just change the scale of my x-axis so that it begins at 20. So I'm going to select my x-axis and click on the chart icon in this pane, and you can do all kinds of different formatting within the chart itself by using these different categories. But I'm going to go up to Axis Options and change the bounds. My minimum, I'm going to change it from 0 to 20. And that'll make the trends a little more apparent. And there we go. So now I can see very clear differences within the temperature range of my study. And from here, I can go ahead and copy the chart and paste it into a presentation, or I can get rid of the legend and the chart title and add it to my research paper.